So are we ready to go, Matthew?
Yep.
Great. Well, welcome everybody to our panel. This is a panel titled Retreat to Justice, looking at dimensions of justice and managed retreat along California's coast. And I am Charles Lester. I'm the director of the Ocean and Coastal Policy Center at the Marine Science Institute at UC Santa Barbara. And we're very happy to be here today. We have three other panelists and myself talking about different issues and cases along California's coast. And I will introduce them briefly here, and then we'll get into it. We have Alyssa Mann, who is a project director with the Nature Conservancy working in California. We have Stephanie Sikich-Quinn, who's a coastal preservation manager with the Surfrider Foundation, and Tiffany Wise-West, who's the Sustainability Climate Action Manager for the City of Santa Cruz in Central California. And as many of you probably know, we've been thinking about sea level rise and coastal resilience for at least a decade now in California, and in recent years have really been digging into the science of sea level rise and coastal change, adaptation planning and vulnerability assessments. And we have dozens of local governments now that have been working on vulnerability assessments and figuring out how to adapt, identifying adaptation strategies for their local communities. But we also have a very active state coastal management program. And so there has been quite a bit of discussion and deliberation and conflict, frankly, around ideas of how to adapt in various contexts, including this idea of managed retreat, which has received a lot of attention, a lot of political conflict, a lot of pushback at the local level. And so in that sense, I think we're right with the norm of a lot of the discussion that's been happening nationally and internationally about managed retreat, including some of the questions about justice and equity that are raised when you start asking those questions. So we're going to try to give some insights into what we've all been working on and the particular things that are happening in California. And the last thing I would mention before we start that is, or two things really, we also have a lot of activity in our legislature, particularly this year, considering a number of bills relating to implementation or recognition of the problem, implementation of the problem, financing of the problem, and we'll touch on some of those as we get into it. And finally, we had anticipated another panelist who unfortunately wasn't able to join us, but they were going to speak about some of the tribal dimensions and cultural justice questions that are coming up in California. And we have quite an active discussion on that front as well. So we will try to touch on those as we can in our respective presentations. And with that, I will pass it to Alyssa Mann, who's going to talk a little bit about her work with the Nature Conservancy.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, great. Let me share my screen here. And hopefully you can see this now. Yeah, okay, great. Well, hi everybody. It's great to, well, I guess we can't see everybody, but it's great to see the panelists that I have here on the screen together. I'm thrilled to join this great panel on this really important topic. Again, my name is Alyssa Mann, and I'm the Coastal Project Director with the Nature Conservancy here in California. I'm calling in from my home in Pasadena, California, and I would like to acknowledge that I am on ancestral and unceded land of the Tongva and Tatavian people who were the stewards and caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin. So California's coastline is a pretty amazing place. 3,500 miles of outer Pacific coast and inner bay. The coast is home to the highest levels of native species richness in a state that's already the most biodiverse of the continental states. Hold on, so you can see my, okay. And so that means from the rocky intertidal and iconic beaches that make up our outer coast to the marshes and mudflats that dominate our estuaries. Our coastal habitats support amazing biodiversity. I know for me personally, growing up on the coast has influenced my life in small and profound ways. And really, this isn't unusual for Californians. Nearly 90% say the coast is personally important to them. And this is underscored by the strong commitment to the long-term preservation of our coastline with a Coastal Act and other decisions made since then to protect it again and again. So my work on coastal resilience and climate adaptation is centered on working with California's high-risk communities to prioritize natural infrastructure and coastal conservation as we collectively prepare for a new climate reality. Sea level rise fueled by climate change will significantly alter the California coastline as we know it. And equity needs to be central in how we address these challenges to ensure a resilient and biodiverse coast for current and future generations. We still have a long ways to go and a lot to learn and different difficult decisions and trade-offs that need to be considered. But I'm hopeful it can be done here in California. Today, I'm going to discuss one of our on-the-ground demonstration projects in Ventura County called ORMOND Beach, where equity issues are central and where we're working with innovative partnerships to ensure more equitable processes. Oh, am I getting a chat? Yep. I know I haven't moved past the first slide. Of more equitable processes, approaches, and outcomes. So this likely goes without saying, especially at this conference, but sea level rise and coastal hazards are a problem for people. Rising sea levels have already begun to creep up California's shores, bringing with them a whole host of problems for local communities. By 2050, 600,000 Californians will be impacted by coastal flooding and sea level rise, and 150 billion in properties at risk. Sea level rise also threatens nature. In 2018, we teamed up with the state of California's Coastal Conservancy on a comprehensive statewide study to map the state's coastal habitats, evaluate their vulnerability to sea level rise, and identify strategies to mitigate potential loss. And this really is the bad news. With 5 feet of sea level rise, the coast of tomorrow will not look like today's coast, and there's really quite a bit of vulnerability up and down the coastline. At 5 feet, 59% of California's coastal habitats are highly vulnerable. And this really has cascading impacts. 39 rare, threatened, and endangered species are highly vulnerable, and 41,000 acres of already conserved land are projected to be drowned by subtidal waters. So this means the very investments in conservation that we have collectively made over the years are under threat. Due to the many aspects of this challenge, coastal communities across the state are actively developing community adaptation plans and developing strategies for long-term resilience. The resilience of nature and how nature also provides resilience to communities needs to be considered in these adaptation planning efforts. Our science shows us that it is possible to mitigate the losses we're anticipating from sea level rise to achieve our goals for coastal habitat with sea level rise in California, which would in turn provide multiple benefits by reducing risk to people, enhancing quality of life, habitats for species, and also carbon sequestration. But how do we get there? So building on this science that I mentioned from the Conserving California's Coastal Habitat Study, we championed a statewide study called Hope for the Coast. Our study showed us that there was a path to maintain the extent of coastal habitat area in California if we collectively doubled down and invested in these 5 strategies. First, how important it is to maintain the resilient and conservation status of resilient habitat and protect our resilient habitats that are currently unconserved. But it's really these 3 strategies that would mitigate the losses we're anticipating. First is protecting potential future habitat, so investing in minimally developed land that could most easily transition to habitat and provide migration space. These are really the habitat areas of tomorrow. And these can make up for a little over half of the losses we are anticipating from 5 feet of sea level rise. But the other 2 will have to come from these other 2 categories. There are some habitat areas where topography or development prevents migration and therefore could be managed in place for resilience. For example, we may need to add sediments to help them keep pace with sea level rise. And finally, we must also adapt the built environment with a lens to benefiting nature. This is where managed retreat comes into the picture. We found that we really can't get to this idea of no net loss of coastal habitat with sea level rise with conservation strategies alone. So this may mean raising infrastructure to make it more resilient, or moving it out of harm's way to make room for natural infrastructure. And it's really demonstrating these kinds of multi-benefit solutions and collaborations on the ground And then scaling them across the state and really beyond is how we get to a more resilient future. Our joint research is telling us that it is this decade that we must make big progress for our coast and species that depend on it, including people. But how do we consider equity as we're advancing this ambitious vision for California? I was listening to an event recently hosted by UCLA, and the speaker, Hector Hueso from Jobs to Move America, said something that I found really powerful. He said, if we want the environmental movement to succeed, we need justice to succeed. Our strategies need to center on those most harmed, which means centering justice and equity and ensuring a just transition. Research shows us that climate change impacts are often disproportionately distributed across populations. Some populations, particularly those that experience social inequities, are less able to prepare, respond to, and recover from extreme events. While climate change will affect all of us, it will affect the most vulnerable the most, particularly low income and predominantly communities of color who are already grappling with income inequality and social and environmental injustices that will just be exacerbated. From issues around food security, access to clean water, adverse health outcomes, and access to open space and nature, including the coast. 18% of Californians exposed to coastal flooding fall into these more socially vulnerable categories. And throughout the state, including where I live in Los Angeles, the coast is important and essential to many communities throughout the region, not just those that own property adjacent. It's important for coastal jobs, recreation, fishing, education. A study we did here in Los Angeles County found that 30% of coastal jobs are held by residents of disadvantaged communities, most which are inland from the coast. So I want to tell you about a place where I work called ORMOND Beach, where issues around equity are paramount, including in advancing our coastal resilience strategies. While huge and complex challenges exist, this is a project that makes me really hopeful for the future. ORMOND Beach and Point MUGU in Ventura County are just about 70 miles northwest of where I'm calling in from in Los Angeles County. If we were in a room together instead of virtual, I'd ask all of you if you've ever heard of or been to the Ormond Beach wetlands. And if my suspicions hold true with this crowd, it would be a small group or possibly no one. You may know of Point MUGU, but probably not Ormond Beach. So Ormond Beach is a 650-acre wetland complex just north of the naval base at Point MUGU in Oxnard, California. South Oxnard, the community closest to the wetlands, is a farm working community, low income, majority non-English speaking, and also home to a pretty large indigenous population of indigenous communities from Mexico, including Mixtec and Zapotec. This community has had to endure decades of environmental injustice due to industrial development and pollution on its coastline, which has degraded and impacted the wetlands. On one side of the complex, there's a toxic Superfund site, remnants of a now defunct metal recycling plant. And in the middle, a natural gas power plant that is soon to be decommissioned, thanks to activism and the determination of the community and partner organizations. Despite all of this, it's really an incredible jewel of Southern California. Most coastal wetlands have been drained and filled in Southern California or are bisected by major transportation infrastructure like the Pacific Coast Highway. Ormond still has an intact beach, dune, wetland, and upland transition zone, and is critically important for wildlife, including the threatened and endangered species like that call it home, like the western snowy plover, the California least tern, and the tidewater goby, and more. With decades of dedication from the community and organizations, the existing habitat areas have been protected. The Nature Conservancy, along with the State of California's Coastal Conservancy and the City of Oxnard, invested in protecting Ormond Beach and are working to realize a community vision to restore the wetlands for habitat and community resilience, as well as improve public access and enjoyment for the communities, especially South Oxnard, who really haven't had enough access to the coast and nature. The state and the federal government have just invested $2 million in this work so we can complete planning and begin restoration. We're also working with the US Navy just to the south to make the base and the over 1,000 acres of wetlands that they protect resilient to sea level rise, which would mean together with Ormond Beach, it would comprise the largest wetland system in Southern California, spanning 9 miles from Port Hueneme to Point MUGU. This important stretch of coastline is vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal erosion, with much of the complex projected to be inundated as early as 2060 under a high sea level rise scenario. As I mentioned before, this has really been a community-driven vision for Ormond Beach. This summer with the City of Oxnard and the State Coastal Conservancy, we will be releasing a restoration and public access plan, which was about an over 2-year planning process with the community. This plan is a 30% design plan. So from here, we'll be working on final design, environmental review, and permitting, with the hopes to start full implementation in 4 years. Throughout the process, we've partnered closely with CAUSE, which is the Central Coast Alliance for a Sustainable Economy, and MICUP, or the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project, both community-based and environmental justice organizations who've been essential for public outreach, engagement, and addressing equity concerns to ensure the community's perspectives are heard and incorporated wherever possible. This has included door-to-door surveys, focus groups, community events, ensuring multilingual and culturally relevant content. We've really learned so much from their expertise, especially seeing how they've continued to support these communities during the pandemic. And we are ramping up our work with them in this next phase of planning. This is the preferred alternative in the 30% design plan, which includes both habitat restoration and public access enhancements, both designed for resilience based on the sea level rise scenarios projected. It was designed to ensure balance for habitat and people, the terraced wetlands to adapt with sea level rise and encourage migration, protective fencing for endangered birds, realigned waterway channel for habitat and better water quality, improved access locations, trails, overlook platforms, and a new bridge for beach access, to name just a few of the features. As we move into more detailed design, the community's input will be continue to be super critical. Even with this plan, this is just a start. For the long-term resilience of the system, migration space is essential. With help from the US Navy, we closed on an acquisition of an additional 20-acre parcel, which we purchased from the Southern California Metropolitan Water District, which was a missing puzzle piece of the preserve. This was the first acquisition really aimed at protecting future habitat to ensure that these habitats have more room to migrate as sea levels rise. And we'd like to expand those areas with additional acquisitions down the road. So speaking of missing puzzle pieces, we are also working with all of our community partners on repairing and retreating really what was the legacy of industrial development on this coastline to repair and reconnect this natural system. The once through cooling natural gas power plant will decommission in the next couple of years. This won't be an easy or cheap undertaking or simple to get this infrastructure out of the wetlands. But the City of Oxnard has already begun looking at a way to do this through an agreement with the operator to set aside $25 million to contribute towards its removal remediation. We at the Nature Conservancy are also working with the state legislature and federal partners to identify potential funding sources to remove defunct oil and gas infrastructure, which is up and down our coastline. And certainly the 25 million won't be enough, so other funding will be necessary. I'll close and just say that while Ormond Beach may be a place where all of these complex issues around equity, sea level rise, and retreat come together, I really do believe that it will have important lessons, not just for California, but around the country. And really looking forward to hearing more examples in this conference and in this session. And I really look forward to the discussion. I think it's Tiffany that's next. Is that right, Charles?
That is correct. Thank you, Alyssa. That was great. So next we're going to hear from Tiffany Wise West with the City of Santa Cruz, talking about some of her work in recent years there.
Okay, thank you. Can you all see my screen just fine? All right, great. Well, thank you. It's so nice to be part of this panel and to join this conference and share the work that we're doing in the city of Santa Cruz, which is a town of about 65,000 people. We are located on the Central Coast of California, about 70 miles south of San Francisco. We are nestled between the Santa Cruz mountain range and the Pacific Ocean. And so we have this really unique geography that makes us very prone to a range of climate hazards, including sea level rise. So I'll jump right into our most recent work. Here we go. But before I do so, I do want to acknowledge as well that I'm delivering this presentation from the unceded territory of the Awaswas speaking Yupi tribe, which is now, this land is being stewarded by the Amamutsun tribal band. And one thing I love about the city of Santa Cruz and our leadership is that we are, through our Health in All Policies initiative, really taking an internal look and also working with our community to begin, start to embed best practices with respect to land acknowledgements and so forth. And so that's an important procedural piece aside from, of course, our community facing work, as Alyssa, already has mentioned. So today I'd like to talk about our Resilient Coast Santa Cruz initiative. This is a 2-year initiative to really develop the community's vision for long-term resilient coastal management. We do have about 4 miles of coastline, and that is both has cliffs and bluffs as well as low-lying areas. So we are subject to everything from flooding to erosion and coastal storms, in addition to sea level rise. And in this process, we were supported by 2 major grants, one from the California Coastal Commission, which is the agency that regulates the coastal zone in California, as well as Caltrans, our state transportation department. And we worked with a technical team, 2 technical teams actually, made up of primarily local consultants, to do the technical work that was required to come out with our final deliverables, which is a public works plan for 3 miles of that coastline, our iconic West Cliff Drive, and then also a local coastal program amendment. So how we regulate development and on a local level, and having that certified by our Coastal Commission enables us to have more control over how development's done and consistency and so forth. So those are the 2 end goals of these projects, these 2-year projects. And you see on the left-hand side, all the topics that we really wanted to grapple with, and we really wanted to try to continue some work we had done with our coastal adaptation, planning on starting to integrate equity in our work, which was completed in 2018. And again, really with that goal of a resilient and equitable future coastline. So just to take a look at what our city looks like and the scope of the projects. So from the far right-hand side, Seabright Beach, you can see our harbor that's oriented to the right of that or the east of that. And then continuing westward, we cross over our San Lorenzo River mouth and onto Maine and Cow Beach, 2 very heavily utilized beaches, both by locals, but tourism in particular. The Seabright State Beach is owned by California State Parks. Continuing from Cow Beach around, here's where West Cliff Drive starts, starting at Cow Beach, wraps around an iconic lighthouse and state-owned park and open space, and continues west through another small open space and over to another state park, Natural Bridges, on the far west side of town. So that's the scope of our project. The yellow dots are all the different access points across the city that both visitors and residents utilize very heavily. It's a very, our West Cliff Drive has a bimodal path, and it's heavily utilized. Okay, and in this process, we were really looking at the 3 categories of adaptation options, and retreat, this was really the first time in our community we had begun to talk about retreat in any kind of detail. It had come up in our adaptation plan. It was built in as a strategy to evaluate, but had never been evaluated before. And we also had done this work in our climate adaptation plan update from 2018 to integrate a social vulnerability to climate change assessment into our work. And this was actually, I worked on this with Dr. Giuliano Khalil, who is presenting in another session here, I think overlapping with us on something else. But at any rate, our social vulnerability to climate change assessment, we built a score by census block group. And then we rank them relative to one another. So what you see on the screen is red are the areas with high social vulnerability based on those drivers, and green is that with low. And so, there was not a big surprise that we knew that our Beach Flats neighborhood had high social vulnerability due to a lot of low income folks living there, people not speaking English, and if you overlay then our climate hazard zones, which is kind of this these blue areas here, you see there's this overlap, right? And so it's just what Alyssa was talking about, that we all know that the folks that are, the most underserved, most underrepresented, and have the most burdens already are further burdened by this risk related to sea level rise. And so that was a key target neighborhood for us to build relationships with, or build on relationships, I should say, and build new ones, and to focus our work. And how we use this, just as a quick aside, we just are scratching the surface still of how we can utilize this, but we know that everything needs to go out in Spanish and English down in that neighborhood, whether it's reverse 911 calls on flooding or whatnot. And, in different areas, there's another area where that's red next to an open space where we know there's high wildfire potential. Well, that high social vulnerability is driven by a large incidence of old folks' homes. So we know in our routing for evacuations, we need to get there first because those folks have mobility issues. So we really wanted to springboard off of this kind of base assessment that we had done and more internalize this work in this follow-up sea level rise project over 2 years. So just to zoom in a little bit more on the Beach Flats area, this shows you some of the projections of coastal storm flooding and sea level rise. This is actually coastal storm flooding that you can see projected out through different time horizons. The lighter the color is the further out in time. You can see the key on the lower right-hand side where we're looking at 5.2 feet of sea level rise in these areas that are, really the lightest blue. But California Coastal Commission does want you also to analyze an extreme condition up to 10 feet of sea level rise. So we have done so as well. Qualitatively, I should say, and intend to put some more resources into that in future projects. This then depicts erosion and landslide potential. And you can see there's no landslides in this area that I'm showing, which again, this is the Beach Flats. I'm honed in on our neighborhood that is most vulnerable. And you can see that there is a seawall. The black and white line is a seawall, but it's not a true seawall. It's more of a footer foundation of a basement and then a short curb wall. And then there are a number of coastal access points. That is our Santa Cruz Boardwalk, by the way, in front of the Beach Flats neighborhood. So the main beach and the recreation and tourism continues down towards the river mouth. Now, what you're seeing is if these coastal structures did not, were not able to hold back, we make an assumption by 2060 that they can't, that there will be, that they would not be able to if under the current structures that are there. And we would make the assumption that we would not replace them likely in 2060. So this is where we would expect erosion with no intervention. And then this is rising tide alone, so sea level rise alone. And you can see on the screen, my Zoom's a little blocking it, but the projections of the different volumes of the beach that are projected to be gone. But our main beach could likely be gone by 2100 should we not respond in some kind of a way. So those are the combined hazards. And how we approached this was using an adaptation pathways approach. This is, again, the same specific beach. This is the sequence of near to long-term adaptation options that are available to the city. And as you can see in the lower left hand, managed retreat is always one of those options in the long term. So again, gave us an opportunity to discuss this. Just real quickly on adaptation pathways, this is a planning paradigm that under deep uncertainty, like sea level rise, when exactly do we experience what? And instead relies on triggers, physical triggers in some cases, financial in others, to indicate when to initiate a subsequent adaptation strategy. So it's a proactive approach. And that's why you can see these green kind of triggers on the screen here. And so we use these kinds of visualizations to help convey a whole lot of information about the different options that are available. And this really was a key thing that we tried to break down to be able to talk about with different groups in different ways. And so let's talk about that. And this is just one other map that kind of shows some of these adaptation options actually mapped out over time. And you see, 3A, 3B retreat. And there were 3 different pathways that we'd identified. So how do we talk about this with our community? We did a ton of outreach like never before. And really, I have to acknowledge like UCSC's Coastal Science and Policy Graduate Program that lends so much capacity. Every year we do mini projects that actually move us right along in our work. They helped us to structure and devise questions and facilitate our focus groups with special interest groups, including historically underrepresented and underserved groups. We further broke out and had one-on-ones with historically underrepresented and underserved groups. So I'm going to show you some results of that in a moment. We did 126 interviews, door-to-door interviews down in our target neighborhoods, and learned a lot from them. A lot of this was about building relationships and trust. There has been some historic mistrust with this neighborhood in the city. So that was something that we really needed to grapple with. But in those interviews, they gave us preferences for their beaches and problems with the coastline and where they live. And we found out things like a lot of people have mold in their homes that we didn't, that's another issue that needs to be taken care of. But, it's not necessarily sea level rise. At any rate, we did virtual reality. I'm going to show you that. And we did some other things that weren't so successful. I'm going to share those too. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this shows how everything's connected throughout the project, how each of the engagements fed into every part of the project and the deliverables that resulted. And these are a couple of things that we did. And I have to say that our work in embedding equity is constantly iterative. We try things, we vet them with our equity advisors, try things, some things work and some things don't. Right here are great examples of things that didn't work. We have on the left-hand side an Esri story map that was fully translated that showed a lot of what you saw already in terms of the images on this is what we're expecting for this neighborhood. The adaptation pathways and lots of explanatory stuff fully translated. We didn't have a single, and then with the survey on preferences, that was one of our primary data collection techniques, and it did not work. Similarly, on the right-hand side, we had a community meeting that we went, and it was virtual, that we went to. We had fully translated and everything, and we didn't have anybody show up. So what we've learned to be smarter and more strategic with this kind of thing, and instead we are setting up our projects from the beginning by asking our advisors and surveying our community. What are the right times of the day? What days of the week? What do you need to have in order to enable you to come to our meeting or to come to you? And just being very flexible in our approach has, I think, yielded better results. But we did have things that did work. And I would say that the focus groups, the one-on-ones, meetings, the virtual reality, which was fully translated and narrated, were successful. And that's great. And we did have on our technical advisory committee representatives from this community. So we were getting consistent feedback on the technical aspects as well. Here's what we heard from the community. I think that's interesting and relevant to managed retreat. You know, we did talk about retreat, and these are some of the things that came up. Ensure equitable relocation and retreat if and when it's necessary. One thing that we learned is that some folks pay like a set 30% of their income to live in their home that they live in, whether that's an apartment complex or multifamily. And that, hey, if you're going to move us, you have to keep that rent proportion, that rent burden the same. You can't make it go up. So that gets to that a little more specific on the equitable. And then, you know, some of these other things about, hey, they lose their garden, that they actually have crops that they eat when the river floods, and, you know, the ocean puts pressure on the river and it floods, you know, so they have a lot of, you know, they have the knowledge. And so this was really great. And it helped us to connect us up to some of these other things like the mold issues and so forth that, you know, are under other areas of responsibility, but, you know, we can bring the resources and connect the dots. So these are some ideas that people brought forward. And what I want to highlight here, again, relocation. These are ideas coming from our community. A very vibrant community, by the way. I didn't really get to spend enough time on, or I didn't spend enough time on the Beach Flats community. Very vibrant community, very diverse. It's only 4 acres, has a community center and lots of community anchor organizations. The mean income is 1/3 of our city's mean income. And parking, beautification, and services definitely need attention there. There's lack of affordable housing, lack of land for economic redevelopment. There's seasonal employment patterns, and safety and language are issues there. But this is a great community, adds so much culture and character, and just great part of our community. At any rate, so these are some of their ideas that were brought forward, coming out of some of the technical, or not the technical work, but the engagement that then was synthesized by the technical team. This is an example of how this actually flowed into the project deliverables. This was, and you can see on the left-hand side, we didn't focus just on our Beach Flats community, but also elderly folks, youth, people living with disabilities, and so on. Even our houseless community here, we had a really, really enriching focus group with them. At any rate, you can see here how we've characterized level of service. We heard things like, hey, you need gender neutral bathrooms. You don't have a bathroom for 4 miles on that stretch. We heard things like there's not enough ADA parking, you know, so all of that is getting incorporated into these, or has gotten incorporated into these deliverables. Lastly, just on kind of the best techniques, you know, really it's putting in the time to meet people and listen. And, you know, that has been, I think, the biggest thing for us to learn. And, you know, just for the sake of the relationship building, like showing up. I also already mentioned leveraging the academic partnerships and other partners, some of our nonprofits, like you're going to hear from STEP. The one-on-one meetings were really the best. And then we're really exploring now, how can we give underrepresented communities the opportunity to lead. We really heard that from the Amamutsun tribal band, and we're actually having a meeting with them this week to understand how can we enable that in our work. to really drive from consultation, involvement, collaboration, to really getting to empowerment and deferring to. This is what we have coming next. So we got our Westcliff Drive plan adopted in April, our LCP amendment. Both of those things are now getting ready to go to the Coastal Commission, our state regulatory agency, later in the year. And so that will be hopefully a smooth process. And then we will have in place our plan and our policies for resilient future coastal management. Coming up next, we're working on coastal change trigger monitoring system and a funding strategy for all of this I just talked about that came out in our plans. We are looking at this also as a potentially an economic development opportunity or a jobs opportunity, perhaps to bring people into like coastal interpretation and so forth. And with that, I'll thank you so much. And you can check out all of our deliverables and more on our engagement at our website and check us out on social. So thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was great. We're looking forward to having some questions and back and forth on some of these things. Next up, we have Stephanie Sikich-Quinn with the Surfrider Foundation, and she's going to talk a little bit about the statewide activities, and I think even go a little bit beyond that to national Surfrider focus. So take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you, Charles. Great job, Tiffany. So I'm coming in from San Diego, the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay tribe. Oops, pardon me. Sorry about that. So Surfrider Foundation has actually been advocating for managed retreat for about 40 years. We have 1 foot in the ocean and 1 foot on the land. We are literally the canaries in the coal mine. We understand the power of the ocean, meteorology, sediment dynamics, wave energy, storm surges, etc. And we also understand that infrastructure in the way of those forces will be extremely problematic. So by de facto, really for about 40 years, we have been advocating for managed retreat, specifically because we find ourselves fighting these large projects, such as beach fill projects or seawalls. And we primarily are fighting these because we know, A, we've built too close to the coast, B, climate change impacts are coming on more strong, and C, we really want to push states and municipalities to look at alternatives such as living shorelines, soft structures, and managed retreat. And why do we do this? Because we obviously know that, first of all, beach replenishment is just a Band-Aid approach to erosion, and seawalls actually exacerbate erosion because they interrupt the natural flow of sand. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of quick case studies here. So in California, the public owns the coastline seaward of the mean high tide. And if you look at the beach here, you can tell that the beach that belonged to the public is essentially gone at this point. But what's interesting about this area is that not only can we no longer access the beach that belongs to the public, but there's easements that have been put in place at some of these locations. So let me just break it down just really quickly. So there's 122 homes, give or take, in this area, and there are roughly 51 public access easements. 30 of those are actually underneath the revetment that you see there. And that revetment that we're looking at, or they were proposing to build another one, which is basically 3 acres in land, and about 2 of those acres would be directly on public trust lands. And Charles is going to talk a little bit more about public trust lands. But to Surfrider, it's abundantly clear that these elite communities of the rich and famous are essentially commandeering our beach. And essentially, as they're doing this, they're creating this beach access inequity. And we essentially are seeing that there's really like an entitlement that is pervasive in some of these elite enclaves. And it's basically where just there's a select few people that are making decisions for millions of people that would like to come and visit this coast, whether they're Californians or not. And of course, as I mentioned before, often some of these communities are just outright dismissing any alternatives and going straight for this hard armoring or beach fill projects. So let me focus a little bit more on Broad Beach and some of the issues we've had with them over the year and how private interest has been commandeering our public beach. So honestly, for about 10 or 15 years, they have been making fake keep away signs, posting them on public access points. They paint their sidewalks red to say no parking. In 2003, they actually hired fake security guards that were shooing the public off of the beach. Again, our beach, the public's beach. In 2005, they illegally bulldozed sand up and down the coast. In 2010, they illegally put down unpermitted sandbags. And really, again, all of this is commandeering our beach, and Surfrider has a compunction that we really believe that the public needs to be compensated for the use of our beach. Essentially, we're looking at Broad Beach as kind of a petri dish. It's extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. And at the end of the day, Mother Nature really doesn't care how rich and famous you are, and sea level rise will soon become your permanent guest. So what have we done? We gave solutions to actually help these homeowners at Broad Beach. You know, there's a misconception that environmentalists are just, you know, oh, everyone's home should just fall into the ocean, and that's not the case. We spent almost 15 years specifically working on solutions in this area. So obviously one of the first recommendations is we asked for them to no longer have fake mechanisms to keep the public off the beach. We also suggested per Malibu's local coastal program that when and if homes are being redeveloped or fixed in any way, shape, or form, they must be raised on caissons. And so regardless, that has to happen anyway. We suggested building a living shoreline. Unfortunately, the homeowners in that area just wanted to dump sand on top of that revetment there. And to Surfrider, it's just like straining spaghetti through a colander with 2 large holes. It just simply won't work, and the sand will go away. Of course, we advocated for managed retreat and relocation. We said, look, raise your homes, move them back as far as possible, buy yourself some time. And of course, this area is exceptionally unsuitable for any residential development. These homes should have never been built here. They were built before the Coastal Act, which is our state law that essentially helps really kind of get rid of bad development. And so at the end of the day, because this location is so poor to build, sea level rise will eventually take over. And at the end of the day, managed retreat is really going to be the only long-standing solution. So funny enough, when we spoke at this conference a couple years ago, I brought up this case study in Del Mar, and things have already changed. So I figured I'd highlight it once again, because we have the same problem of our public beaches being commandeered for private interests, creating this beach access inequity. So the city of Del Mar received a grant from the Coastal Commission to specifically look at adaptation measures for these homes literally right here that you see. Again, because we own the wet sand there, that's our public beach. So we have another element where we're seeing our beaches get sucked up. So as they were going through this grant process, it's very similar to the grant that Tiffany had got for Santa Cruz. They had spent about 2.5 years doing stakeholder meetings, very similar to what Tiffany did. And sometimes that's pretty rare. Like when we look on the East Coast, sometimes there's not as much community involvement with sea level rise planning. And so Surfrider was just beyond excited when this technical advisory group came together. We were actually a stakeholder on it, helping with science, access, etc. So after 2 years of working together and having great collaboration, despite that collaboration, unfortunately, the homeowners went rogue, kind of killing the goodwill that we had spent for the past 2 years, and really dismissing what they said that they would do and their kind of fiduciary responsibility for this grant themselves. So just recently, the city has updated their plans. They have removed managed retreat as an alternative, again, despite the grant saying that they might look at that, or they should look at that. So what are the lessons learned here? Again, entitlement is pervasive, and this entitlement discriminates against the general public, and it's creating a very unjust situation. And moreover, this entitlement is impeding on the progress of what could be managed retreat, and it's hindering us to where it's eventually going to be unmanaged retreat. And that's the last thing we want. And that's why we're working on this in a preemptive way, so we don't have to have unmanaged retreat. So let me take you to the next quick example. So here we are up in San Francisco at Ocean Beach. We have been working on this project roughly for 30 years. So the city of San Francisco is very progressive, forward thinking with pretty much everything, as we all know. And so our chapter up there was kind of walking hand in hand with them on how we look at this chronic erosion that's taking place around Golden Gate Park. So we said, okay, let's jump in the fray. Let's help you update the local land use plan, and then come together with a big vision of creating the Ocean Beach Master Plan. And we did it. Again, it took almost 3 decades. And one of those plans entailed relocating the Great Highway, which you see right here on the left, which is a road that goes around Golden Gate Park, and then to relocate these parking and restrooms so that they could also be in a safer place, because you can't really tell, but towards the beach, it's extremely unsafe for recreating. It's just a bunch of big boulders that really you can't get across. So we're so excited we got this managed retreat in the fray, and now, unfortunately, the city is reneging on some of the plan. So in addition to the managed retreat that they had promised to build a living shoreline. And unfortunately, it sounds like, and again, we literally are paying attention day by day to this, that they're proposing to build a traditional 40-foot long seawall, and they want to dump sand on it, which is the same problem we just saw on Broad Beach. You need to create a functioning dune for that sand to stay. And really, anytime, as I mentioned, we have seawalls go down, we are creating that erosion problem that is stealing our public beaches. So if this seawall goes in, it almost defeats all of the good work we've done, because our public beaches will once again be commandeered, and we won't have that access. So we're really hoping to try to convince them to go back to having a living shoreline so that we can have that interface between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems that give and take and build our beaches in a dynamic way, rather than just a revetment that causes erosion. Oh, a couple lessons that we learned here, and I think they're extremely important for those of you chiming in, is we learned that it's extremely important to be present at the beginning when the city and engineers are looking at different adaptation plans. It's just as Tiffany talked about, but for NGOs to be present while that's going on. And the second lesson that we really learned there was that our continual advocacy for managed retreat over 30 years always bubbled up to the top of mind, because we were simply endlessly advocating for that. I just want to highlight one East Coast example to kind of give you an idea of really the difference of communities, but also that there's this kind of entitlement and privilege that seems to go on sometimes that we're clashing with, right? And you can see my theme now is private interest taking our public beach, creating inequitable beach access, and really creating an unfair system for all recreationalists, or in this case, fishermen who are actually fishing for sustenance sometime. So anyways, this is the Montauk Lighthouse, and it was commissioned by George Washington, and it was built 200 years ago. It was 300 feet away from the bluff, and in the past 200 years, it has eroded 200 feet, and there's only about 100 feet left before it gets to the bluff. So clearly, this is in harm's way. So we actually commissioned a study to show that this would be a viable managed retreat, would be a viable option, and not only just so that we can save it from falling into the ocean, but it would be economic in the end instead of constantly having revetments and maintenance. And of course, it'd be more environmentally friendly because, again, you have that exchange between the ocean and the terrestrial environment, creating more of a natural system. Unfortunately, that didn't work. They're going to be putting down more revetment. And as I said, when that revetment goes down, we lose our public access, and some of these fishermen who are fishing for their families lose their ability to fish. So here's a positive and my last example of a case study. And every year I bring this up because it truly is one of the best managed retreat cases I personally think in the world. It includes a living shoreline, as you can see here. We moved back a parking lot. We moved back the road that was creating extreme erosion. I mean, at one point you can see where there's sand in the front there. Before that, again, it was just riprap sticking up, totally unsafe for the public to come and recreate. after 10 to 15 years of working on this, my colleague Paul Jenkin, who really gets all the kudos for doing this, was able to work with the city and the county and even federal government to get funds to essentially do this relocation project. And as they did the managed retreat over the years, we're seeing again that our public access has been restored. And as Alyssa was mentioning, this area is home to a huge diverse community, some disproportionately affected by economic implications, and they come to this area to recreate. And so for us, this is a perfect example of equity for all community members involved. And we really just kind of always hang our hat on this because it is a positive example. Now, I just want to briefly talk about what we need to have in the future to have resilient relocation. That's basically what I'm trying to call it, because as we know, managed retreat is definitely not the best word. Americans don't like to retreat. But in addition, we want it to be long lasting and resilient. But how do we get to that? So clearly, we're at a place where we need to increase our outreach and education. And it's not just to community members, it's to decision makers. We need to really destigmatize managed retreat in itself and put a really good, clear emphasis on that there's long-term cost savings, it's protecting communities, it's protecting our environment, and it's mitigating against what I call the climate crisis fears or climate guilt that we all have. We all know that there's looming problems. And if we can say we're getting ahead of the climate crisis and we're going to do these proactive measures and tell these communities that it's doable, then it won't be so contentious. Why is it so contentious? To some degree, I have to say, the media is really focused on looking at this as political flashpoints and conflict, and we need less of that. We need more in-depth investigative reporting on cities, states, and countries. There's many countries around the world that are successfully implementing managed retreat. We need to focus on that. We also need to focus on, this is not a mandate from the federal government or your state government, or again, this isn't environmentalists wanting you to have your home fall into the ocean. We need to highlight that there's already communities and individuals who are doing autonomous relocation. I have friends that work in Napa that are literally moving because they're afraid of fires. I have friends on the East Coast that want to sell their homes because they're afraid of hurricanes. So this is already happening. And since we're all here for this conference, we know that this is on the rise. And if we can get ahead of it with education, which includes us, NGOs, academics, and media, I think we'll really make some headway with this. Towards the end here, I think it's critical, and I'm sure all of us have talked about this at this conference, and I don't need to belabor it, but we need to have tax breaks and incentives for people who do managed retreat. We need Congress to step up the monies that they appropriate. We need our federal agencies to do grant programs to immediately give to disadvantaged communities that are contemplating managed retreat, or cities that are chronically eroding and they need immediate attention. And I do have to say that FEMA and HUD have been better in the past few years with this. They have put some monies together to ensure that we are doing some of this planning with these disadvantaged communities that are experiencing extreme erosion. As Tiffany talked about, the public needs to have trigger-based planning. I mean, again, Surfrider has the compunction that we have to be compensated for our public beach, and it has to look a specific way. So if certain triggers are in place, like if it erodes up to this much, then you can do beach replenishment. When the beach replenishment is gone, then maybe you can do managed retreat. Getting those triggers in place. We obviously, as we can kind of pay back the public and take back some of this beach access inequity, we can do that through conservation easements or deed restrictions. We can set up beach mitigation fees, as we have in Solana Beach, where the local homeowners pay a nominal fee every year. It goes into a bucket, and that is used in the future for shoreline maintenance, shoreline management, to kind of, again, recoup the public for our beach that has been taken. How about taxing some of those that benefit the most from the coast? And I don't need that in a socialist crazy way. I'll give you a very specific example. In North Carolina, in the town of Avon, they're essentially taxing their residents by the proximity to the coast. So those that live the closest will pay the most because they are the biggest beneficiaries of the coastline there. And then the further you go out from the coast, the less taxes people will pay. Finally, it is absolutely imperative for us to reform the National Flood Insurance Program to ensure it's affordable for all kind of middle income Americans. And of course, I personally believe that we need to waive premiums for those people that are disadvantaged economically. Now, finally, I'm going to do my last wish to focus on the positive of how we can even get further. And really, it just comes down to legislation, as Charles had mentioned, and he can get into a few other things. But the more that we can have state and federal legislation that mandates and requires climate change planning, the better off we're going to be. More states are starting to implement this kind of legislation. I'm really, really into disclosures and how that should work. Considering that 40% of Americans live along the coastline, there's a lot of money at stake. And right now, just recently, in California last year, our legislature had a disclosure legislation that failed. Right, currently in Washington, my colleague literally as of today is working in a technical advisory group where they're thinking about how they put sea level rise planning into their shoreline master plans and how they incorporate disclosures of hazards when people are buying and selling homes. And the most positive example I have right now is in Hawaii. Currently, there's a bill on the governor's desk, got passed both House and Senate, and it would require that sea level rise is basically disclosed for any new homeowner. Disclosures are critical because it helps the federal government understand where buyouts are going to be condensed. As A.R. Siders mentioned in her speech yesterday, there was a GAO report that essentially shows that buyouts are the main mechanisms that federal agencies are using when it comes to infrastructure that has repetitive flood loss. And finally, I will end, as this is a conference that is focusing on justice and inequity. We need state and federal legislation that requires that frontline communities who are experiencing the most intense impacts of sea level rise and just climate change impacts in general, and those that are economically disadvantaged, small businesses as well, are going to have to receive these funds first, so we can take care of the most vulnerable first and help the small businesses that help keep these people employed. So it really is full circle. And so I can just advocate that all of us go to our state legislature, and there's a piece of federal legislation, the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, that has some of these solutions in there. And so we really just want to focus on what we can do to, again, close that loop for the disadvantaged communities and ensure our beaches are no longer commandeered for private interests. So thank you.
That was great, Stephanie. A lot there. Let me get my screen shared here and see if I can connect some of the dots, but you see that okay?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to talk about questions of managed retreat and justice from a slightly different angle today, and do it through the lens of thinking about public tidelands and the public trust doctrine. And of course, this idea is something that goes way back to Roman times, and the notion that certain things by natural law are common to all of us. So that includes the sea and consequently the seashore, according to Institutes of Justinian. But the public trust doctrine is generally speaking this notion that these lands that lie in between the mean low tide and the mean high tide are public lands held in trust for the public. And out of this comes this doctrine that there's a right of the public to use these lands for commerce, navigation, and fisheries. And in more recent times, that has been extended to things like recreation and wildlife values and all of the embedded values in this space that we call public tidelands. So I'm really interested in this physical space along our shorelines, and in particular, what the implications of the landward movement of these lands is as sea level rises, and more particular, what the implications are in places like this, and some of the questions that you've heard about already and that Stephanie raised directly, places like Malibu, Stinson Beach in Marin County, Solana Beach in San Diego County, Del Mar, all of these places in California where we have extremely valuable real estate right up against the shoreline and on the shoreline, on the beach in many places. So I'm interested in the questions of justice around these dimensions that might be framed as public versus private ownership, state interest versus local interest, public interest versus individual interests, environment versus society, all of these ways of slicing that question. And in the context of this conference and much of what we've heard, I'm also interested in how thinking about tidelands informs our understanding of this question of who or what is the community when we talk about community-based adaptation. So let me take a step back and just briefly talk about what I would call the social justice roots of California coastal protection. As you heard, we have a statewide law, and in 1972, we passed something called Proposition 20. Among other things, that proposition declared that the coastal zone belonged to everyone, and that also we should be concerned about present and future generations. So right up front, we said this is a universal ownership question and one of intergenerational equity. The plan also talks about it being embedded in our Constitution and the right that persons of all income levels should have opportunities to live near the coast, and also that the property rights of a landowner are not absolute. So this was also then connected to the notion that we don't want to enable development to have adverse impacts on the public tidelands that we all own and that are something that should be enjoyed by future generations. So the public trust was embedded from the beginning. Well, as you heard a little bit from Stephanie, one of the main ways we've done that in California over the last 5 decades is to require public access easements for new development in certain circumstances, basically of 2 types. One called the lateral access dedication, and these are the dedication of the land between private development on the shoreline and the mean high tide line for public access, or a vertical access dedication, which is the ability to get from the first public road to the shoreline. This is an example on the right at so-called Billionaires Beach in Malibu. So these 2 mechanisms have been used quite a bit. And in the early years of the coastal program, hundreds and hundreds of access dedications were required by the State Coastal Commission, including, for example, like this trail network and access down to the shoreline at the Trump National Golf Course. So nobody was off limits from this kind of restriction. No landowner, no matter how rich, no matter how famous, could avoid this kind of regulation along the California coast. In the late 80s, the Supreme Court, of course, intervened in this exercise of management by saying that in one case in particular, the Coastal Commission had failed to make an adequate connection between the requirement for a dedication and the impacts that they were supposedly managing. This is that house, the Nolan site in Ventura County. And in that case, the Coastal Commission had, among other things, found that there were hundreds of miles of publicly owned tidelands that had already been walled off. This walling off creates a psychological barrier to public use of tidelands, and therefore there needed to be an access dedication to offset that impact. This is in general what they did. They required a deed restriction that would acknowledge the public's right to pass and repass in the space between the toe of the private revetment and the mean high tide line. And that's what the Supreme Court said didn't fly in this case, because there wasn't an adequate connection between this idea of the walling off of the coast and a dedication to be able to use tidelands. I did want to highlight, though, that the minority opinion in that case by Justice Brennan talked about how this deed restriction did provide a formal declaration of the public's right of access, speaking of disclosures, thereby ensuring that the shifting character of tidelands would not jeopardize enjoyment of that right from the impacts of the development. Now, I highlight the shifting character of the tidelands because that's really important to understand when we think about public tidelands in this context, which is that tidelands are ambulatory. So the mean high tide line is a function of the elevation of the sea with the shoreline, wherever that might be. And so people like who work for Surfrider know that the beach changes all the time. And so the summer tidelands might be further out because the beach has been built up. Winter tidelands would be further inland because the beach is eroded. And so the tidelands amble back and forth depending on the nature of the shoreline at the time and how big they are also. So in effect, you have a zone of concern for tidelands, not a mean high tide line fixed in one location. It really depends on when you're looking as to where they are. So we can see that in this example from USGS, where multiple tide lines have been identified mean high tide lines over numerous decades, and you can see how much it fluctuates over time. This is just going back and forth. Same thing, a survey by the State Lands Commission in the last year shows you that just from a December survey to a January survey, there was a shift of over 60 feet of the mean high tide line inland because of the elevation of the beach. So it's moving, it's ambling. Well, before I get to the bigger issue there, we also know, as Stephanie alluded to and talked a little bit about, that when you try to fix that line on the shoreline, you end up with a lot of serious impacts to beaches, things like the shrinking of a beach in front of a seawall, as opposed to the continuing recession of that beach on an eroding shoreline. Here you can see the same story. This beach in 1972 has essentially disappeared in front of the two properties with the revetment and continued to persist where there is no revetment. Again, if we develop right on an eroding shoreline, like this case in Pacifica, you can imagine where the beach should be had we not developed in this location, and with the sea encroaching on that shoreline. And of course, the further out we get into the ocean, the more we're going to impact public tidelands by physically encroaching on or interfering with their presence at that location. We've also learned to elevate, and I appreciate the recommendation for Broad Beach folks to elevate, but we know that even if we elevate tidelands, they're not going to stop. They may come up to and under these developments in the future. And this might be our typical beach view if we allow everyone to elevate but stay. So how bad a problem is this? Well, it really depends on what your projections are for sea level rise and what the slope of your beach environment is. But you can see, depending on those assumptions, you could have movement of up hundreds of feet of inland of tidelands as sea level rises. So it will be moving, and it's going in one direction generally. In Del Mar, for example, which you heard about, they projected the shoreline, USGS has projected that the shoreline with the meter of sea level rise would be right up against these houses. So your beach is gone, whether that happens in 2100 or maybe sooner. Same story here, Sandyland in Carpinteria, where the projected shorelines are overtaking the residential development. And this is the 6-foot projected sea level rise line, perhaps in 2100, perhaps later. And even in one of our often talked about living shoreline projects in Southern California, these are the projected shorelines for sea level rise and relationship to that project. So we might think it's a living shoreline, but only for so long. At Ventura at the Nolan property today, these are what the tidelands look like. And so if we do that kind of projection there, you can see also that the tidelands, just with 1 meter of projected sea level rise in 2100, are already behind the Nolan site. And of course, at 2 meters, you're well inland of the site where we had this dispute about public access. This is well represented by a slide of an actual tidal condition a year ago, the king tide. This is the site of the Nolan property down here. You can see it's basically a bathtub with the water smack up against the seawalls, illustrating well what the ocean is going to continue doing at a place like this. So we've been thinking about the public tidelands regulation question for a long time, really since the beginning. And early on, there were decisions like this one where the Coastal Commission specifically made an effort to avoid approving development that would encroach on tidelands in its original siting. But it's only in more recent years where this tideland question has actually become one of these triggers that you've heard about from Tiffany and Stephanie, a trigger for adaptation action in the future. And in these cases, it may be far off, but basically the Coastal Commission is now putting in place a permit condition that says property owners will remove the development if the property is no longer located on private property due to migration of the public trust boundary. So we've built in this idea that you can't stay there if it's public land. On the other hand, we have a California State Lands Commission that has for almost 100 years now been managing state lands and issuing leases for private encroachments onto tidelands. So for example, this series of seawalls in Solana Beach is associated with a number of tideland leases from the state to allow that encroachment to happen. And this is an example of one of those where this condominium complex has a lease for $24,000 a year to the state in order to encroach on the tidelands at this location. Now, this this system raises the question of, well, when is that encroachment not okay? Or is it okay? And we have to go back to one of the original legal decisions from the US Supreme Court, the Illinois Central case, to remind ourselves that the state can allow this kind of giving away of tidelands or public lands if there's not a substantial impairment of a public interest in those lands. So that really raises the question of, well, what would be a substantial impairment? As developments get further out into the tidelands and as tidelands move further inland, at some point that becomes a substantial concern. And it raises in the bigger picture something the California Supreme Court has articulated in 1983, which is that there is a public affirmative duty of state agencies to protect the public's interest in these commonly held lands like tidelands. Moreover, as articulated by an appellate court, the determinative question is the impact of an activity on the public trust land. So it's going to be hard to say that there isn't an impact in situations like the string of homes in Malibu, increasingly as sea level rises, raising the question of, well, what do we do about it? The last legal case that I want to highlight is the Milner case out of the Ninth Circuit at the federal level. And this is a case where the Army Corps of Engineers brought an action for trespass against these homeowners in this area for encroachment of their revetment and seawalls onto public tidelands. Out of that case came this decision that because of the ambulatory natural conditions along the shoreline, both the tideland owner and the upland owner have a right to an ambulatory boundary. Well, the corollary of that is that the homeowners do not have a right to permanently fix that property boundary absent agreement by the tidal lands owner. So in other words, those lands will continue to move inland and can't be stopped by a seawall or a revetment unless there's an agreement to do that. Well, that sets the stage for some extreme conflict between public tidelands and private uplands. And so one of the things that we need to keep in mind to remember is that the Supreme Court has also told us that background principles of local state common law can be used as a basis for regulation and not implicate a takings concern that you'd be taking private property out of the Lucas case. And so public trust is exactly that, a common law doctrine in the background principles of most states' property law. And so we need to keep that in mind. That makes it an open possibility for pursuing this question of managed retreat. Now, let me talk briefly about some legislation that's pending and that I think is relevant because it really flips this question around of property ownership and who owns what and who pays for what. And this is this idea pending in Senate Bill 83 to establish a sea level rise revolving loan fund, which would enable local governments to essentially get state money to buy properties that are at risk and then lease those properties back in order to help pay off the loan until such time as those properties were no longer viable along that shoreline location. So it's a managed retreat buyout program. Now, it has received a lot of support, including from Surfrider and the Nature Conservancy, and I think the city of Santa Monica. I don't know if the city of Santa Cruz is thinking about it, but it's raises this question of, well, how do we manage the retreat right along this private public interface and who is paying for it and how? It has received some criticism as well as, is this a buyout program for the rich? So bracket that question. I'll come back to that if we have time. So these are the kinds of questions that I've been thinking about as I focus on tidelands. And this is the beach that I was walking up and down during the pandemic times. I know it was not so hard for some of us, but thinking about, well, where is the mean high tide line here? When will it encroach upon these private properties? And what about this sign that's on this rock here that tells me that I may be on private property if I'm on the landward side of the mean high tide line? Well, I'm wondering, well, when will these properties be on my land with sea level rise? These are the kinds of questions that I think we need to start asking and playing out in particular places. And let me just wrap up with a broader observation, which is, I really like the idea of resilience as a transformative opportunity. And I like this quote that suggests that deliberate transformation, if we want to achieve resilience, involves breaking down resilience of old systems and building new systems, resilience of new systems. And so I think one of the things that the tidelands focus for me does is use the property law system itself to begin confronting the vested interests, the appropriators that Stephanie talked about, that use property law and that set up these relationships of institutions and power that are defining what happens along these shorelines, and maybe moves us forward in breaking down some of these systems. And I think we have to acknowledge that the property law system itself, including the idea of the public trust, is a civil and common law tradition that came in with the colonialism in California and elsewhere. So it begins for me to raise the more fundamental questions about how do we think about this land and who owns and stewardship that is universal and intergenerational. That hence the justice questions for me. So I will stop there, and I guess we have a few minutes for questions, perhaps. And let me check the chat here. So we have a question for Tiffany to start. How do we keep Santa Cruz rural and unpopulated with an influx of wealthy home buyers? How do you deal with homeless and the rising drug problems that have moved in and out of the coastlines?
Okay, thank you for that question. So just wanted to make clear that while Santa Cruz County is largely rural along the coast, the city of Santa Cruz is largely urbanized. So just to clarify that. But secondly, I have to say that you've struck on in terms of affordable housing and people experiencing homelessness are two probably biggest issues that we have here in the city. And they certainly do intersect with climate and sea level rise. Thus the integration of our homeless population into our work and of course, contact with our business organizations, real estate and so forth. As far as how to deal with homelessness and affordable housing, we have departments that are working on that, and those are complicated issues. And I really am not the person to speak on behalf of the city to represent those issues. Suffice to say, those are challenging issues, and there are multifaceted approaches going on in coordination with our county and our state partners. But my work is really where it intersects with the coastal resilience.
Thanks, Tiffany. I would add that California, of course, like many places, does have a housing issue, an affordability issue, and there's a lot of work going on state and locally about how to deal with that. And from my own standpoint, these issues have to be ultimately addressed in an integrated fashion by local communities, given the necessary relationships and movement of peoples and the way lots of our shorelines are developed currently with extremely unaffordable property. But those are larger scale planning questions and also related to the incentives that we have. And I'm going to return to that in a second, but let me just ask Alyssa this question about your work with Indigenous groups at ORMOND and some of the things that they proposed.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, what I mentioned in my presentation, certainly this area is an important area from the tribal organizations and tribes in California, so primarily different bands of the Chumash. But as I mentioned, we also have a pretty large population of Indigenous groups from Mexico, and that's the Mixteco and Zapotec communities. And in a lot of the interactions that we've had in both of those communities is how kind of stewardship and thinking through sort of more historic practices are central in both of those kind of community groups. And so there's a lot to be learned, I think, from sort of traditional groups as we do things, look at restoration options. And so we are learning things in that way as well. The question was about what do we we get out of having these engagements. Ultimately, these projects are long haul. I think that's what's, I think, sometimes frustrating for the communities. It's been decades trying to conserve and restore Ormond Beach, and how important it is to have a really engaged electorate and community there to be able to support that work. That's really how we can succeed in what we're trying to do for both wildlife and people. There was another question in here I saw about what is 30% design. For those of you that do sort of long-term restoration planning, we do more sort of visionary work and setting out sort of the parameters of what we're trying to achieve. And sometimes a lot more of the detail ends up being when you get towards 100% design. So, right now we're at this point where we've sort of designed conceptually around trails, around boardwalks, a bridge. There's so much more detail that has to be worked out before we can get to the point where we can implement any of those ideas. And that's true for the public access features too. So, we'll definitely lean on the community to figure out what would they want here. Do they want park benches and picnic tables in some places? Do they want some visitor center amenities? Is the boardwalk and bird viewing critical? And how do they access? How do they get here? All of those pieces are super critical as we get to final design and permitting.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. I always understood 30% is how much you needed to do in order to get external funding in order to finish the project. Anyway, we don't have very much time left, but I wanted to sort of wrap up some of these other questions related to property and the question about the buyout program that I mentioned. And in particular, if you think about the question of managed retreat and land values and ownership patterns, and then in the larger context of this conference, we're spending a lot of time talking about breaking down some of the institutional and historic structural barriers to decision-making and participation, and what is justice in this context. How do you think about this buyout program? And would each of you see ways in which you would potentially use it, and what are maybe some of the downsides? And so, what are the circumstances where it might seem to be something that's useful to think about or not? Stephanie or Tiffany?
Yeah, I'll just jump in super quick. There was a question about how oftentimes some strategies will fall in failure for development, and that definitely wasn't what I was trying to impart. I'm talking about existing development. So it's not we're fighting new development, is what is happening in places that there already are. And so that's some of those collective new higher intervention strategies are what this whole panel was about, particularly what Tiffany's presenting, that we need trigger-based planning so that if a home that's already existing and the beach is in front of there is lost, that's public needs to be compensated, or another mechanism needs to go into place. So I definitely didn't want to construe anything that we're always up against development. It's actually protecting our beach from the development that's already essentially commandeering the sand that should be on the beach. So I wanted to make that distinction between existing development and not.
So let me push you on that. So Surfrider was one of the organizations supporting the buyout legislation. So we should be buying out the homeowners that are appropriating our beaches.
To some degree, no, that's not going to be able to happen until we have more federal and state funds to do that. But it's also the legislation where we can have a rent back so that we can get the owner more whole with their mortgage before the house is inhabitable or other nature. So really the solution to these buyout programs come down to federal and state monies. And I think that we should prioritize homes that need to be purchased, like in Hurricane Sandy, how there were homes on Staten Island that were for lower income individuals that were purchased first before they went to other places in New York and New Jersey to purchase those homes. I also think that homeowners that are exceptionally wealthy, there needs to be some type of pitching in that can maybe match some of the federal funds that are there. After all, for years, as I've been saying, our public beaches have been starved. We can no longer use them. So we need to be compensated just as much as those wealthy homeowners.
So perhaps a shoreline tax to fund the buyout program. That sounds like a great amendment. Tiffany,
I can say just one more thing about this one. I do think, you're right that we're not going to be able to buy our way out of this problem in California, right? There's billions and billions of dollars of private homes, let alone public infrastructure on the coast. But I think from our perspective, there are some opportunities where we can make strategic buyouts and from an outcome perspective as well. Where are those places where it might have an outsized benefit to some of the natural resources and amenities, public amenities that we really care about? And so thinking through where are those places, where can local governments prioritize that? And I think this bill is one first step, right, in looking at establishing some funding sources for some of these more voluntary programs. I don't think it's going to be the end all be all for managed retreat in California, but it is a first step, especially if we can better center sort of nature outcomes and like what you talked about today, Charles, with public trust and public land.
Right. Well, I tend to agree with you on that, and I think it's at least worth adding to the toolbox for now. I didn't describe it in detail, but it does come along with requirements to have plans that would identify why certain places were good places to allocate this kind of a buyout program, and showing that it would pencil out and that you could actually pay back the loan, et cetera. So it's an effort to, I think, and it's voluntary on everybody's part. Local government doesn't have to participate. Nobody has to sell their home. It will be a way to facilitate market transactions, I think, in places that make sense by certain criteria. Personally, yeah, I would prioritize the ones where public values are in play, but as I also suggested, maybe we don't have to pay for things if public values are in play, like trust lands. And I don't know, Tiffany, if you wanted to say anything on this point or any other question to wrap it up.
Well, I am noting in the chat that the event's going to close in a moment, but I'll just say I really agree with largely everything that y'all have said. And there are some opportunities like our beach flats area where we've had more in-depth discussions, but managed retreat in our big expensive homes, we have a road in between the coast and those folks, and we didn't get in depth into that kind of a conversation. However, buyouts are on the table, and I'm putting together the financing package, and I'd like to see a triggers-based approach as to when do we go to something like that in the future. Starting to move those conversations along and talk about, okay, what gets us to this? So
it'll be interesting to see how that plays out at the boardwalk. Thank you all very much, and thank all of those of you who may be listening, and look forward to further conversations.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all.